Hi, I'm Arden. At my brother's rehearsal dinner, my mom called my grandfather a charity case. I stood up for him. She slapped me across the face. In front of everyone. No one said a word. They'd already erased him from the slideshow, the seating chart, the speeches. Later that night, someone handed me a sealed envelope from Langley. Turns out, Grandpa wasn't just the man in the corner seat. He was someone the government tried to forget, just like my family did. And when I opened that file, I found my own name at the bottom. Why was I listed in a folder with dead whistleblowers? And what else had they buried in that vineyard? Besides the truth. I arrived at the Dillinger estate just before sunset, the kind of soft, honey-colored light that photographers call magic hour. Everything looked perfect. String lights hung from manicured olive trees, flickering gently like they were humming some silent, expensive tune. Rustic wooden tables had been draped with ivory linens, menus printed on thick paper set atop folded napkins. The servers, young, polished, dressed in black with white gloves, moved in quiet coordination like a choreographed ballet. It all looked like a vineyard-themed Pinterest board had come to life. And then there was me. I adjusted the strap of my carry-on bag, still dusted with Denver airport residue, and walked across the gravel path toward the welcome station. A young woman holding a clipboard smiled too brightly and said, "Name?" "Arden Shaver," I replied. My voice sounded calm, but inside, something was already tightening. She scanned the list, her eyes narrowing. Then, flipping to a secondary page, she let out a faint, "Oh," that felt heavier than it should have. "You're down as assistant liaison, not confirmed." Her tone was apologetic, but not surprised. "Are you with the caterers?" I stared at her, then at the clipboard, and then at the bold line where my name had been slotted, not among family or even extended guests, but under staff. "No," I said slowly. "I'm family." "Oh," she said again, this time more awkwardly. "Right. Sorry. I can ask someone to check." But I waved her off. I'd already understood what mattered. The thing is, this wasn't the first time. And that's what made it worse. A fluke is forgivable. A pattern is policy. I stepped aside, watching as Vera, my mother, laughed with a cluster of women near the wine bar, holding a glass of something pale and sparkly. She hadn't seen me yet. Or maybe she had and simply chose not to react. My stomach turned, and I tried not to let it show. Back when I was 20, I used to think I was imagining things, that I was being overly sensitive when I was seated with the kids at every Thanksgiving or left out of family portraits because we didn't know you were coming. But now I knew better. "It's not a mistake if it keeps happening," my therapist once said to me. Her voice echoed in my head as I moved deeper into the party, trying not to let the burn reach my face. A man, early 50s, clearly a guest, brushed past me with a smile and held out an empty flute. "Can I get a refill? Brute, if possible." I blinked. "I don't—" "Oh," he chuckled. "Sorry, you just looked—" "It's fine," I said, forcing a polite half-smile. "Hope they keep the brute flowing." He didn't even hear me, just turned toward the bar like I'd vanished. No one corrected him, not even my cousin Allison, who was standing 2 feet away and absolutely heard the exchange. I took a deep breath and turned toward the far side of the lawn, past the carefully arranged seating area, past the high-arched floral entrance where the ceremony would take place tomorrow. That's when I saw him. Harlan Werner, my grandfather, was sitting alone near the service tent, next to an industrial fan and one of those hideous green plastic portable toilets. No place card, no table, just a fold-up chair positioned like someone had said, "Put him somewhere, anywhere." He looked small in his suit, which hung a bit looser than I remembered. The wind kept catching his tie, flipping it sideways. His hands rested neatly on his lap, one holding his cane, the other fidgeting with a silver ring I'd seen him wear since I was a kid. I felt my throat tighten. My mother appeared beside me, sipping her drink, following my gaze. "He insisted on coming," she said. "No greeting, no warmth. That's where you put him?" She shrugged. "He doesn't mind." "He likes quiet corners." I turned to her. "That's not a corner. That's where they put trash bins." She didn't answer. I walked toward him, heels crunching against gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last. "Hey," I said softly as I reached him. Harlan looked up, and for a second, something in his expression shifted. Relief? Pride? Maybe both. "My girl," he whispered. "I thought they'd put you at one of the family tables." "I'm not family anymore, remember?" he replied with a faint smile. "I'm legacy. Legacy means history, and history gets boxed up when it doesn't fit the narrative." I knelt beside him, ignoring the dirt staining my dress. "This isn't okay." "They're afraid," he said quietly. "Of what?" He glanced around. "Some people fear what they owe." The breeze lifted, carrying with it the faint scent of overcooked duck and rose petals. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed quiet, staring at the cheap folding chair that had become a symbol of something so much worse. "They don't hate me," he continued, still looking straight ahead. "They fear the version of me that doesn't fit the one they're selling." I felt something hard press into my palm. He had slipped something into my hand. "Keep it safe," he murmured. I opened my fingers. It was a photo, worn, edges curling, a black and white snapshot of a young man in military fatigues standing beside a sign that read, "Moscow, 1982. He had never mentioned Moscow before, but I was about to find out just how far back this story went. The moment her hand struck my face, time stalled. There was no music, no chatter, no clinking glasses, only the hush of 100 eyes zeroing in on the sound of flesh meeting flesh. It wasn't a slap like in movies, sharp and dramatic. It was colder than that. Precise, public, calculated. Vera didn't scream. She didn't follow it with a lecture. She simply leaned in and whispered, "Get out." Her lips barely moving, her breath tinged with Sauvignon Blanc and something sharper. Contempt. I didn't argue. I didn't shout back. I stood still, long enough to catch the flickers of discomfort crossing faces I'd known since childhood. Cousins, old friends, business partners of my parents. No one moved. No one said a word. So I left, my heels clicking against the patio stone, echoing like gunfire. As I passed Gideon, he looked the other way. Allison pressed her lips together but avoided eye contact. Not one person followed me. I walked beyond the reach of the patio lights, down a path lined with lavender bushes until I found a bench tucked beneath the olive trees. I sat, the cold air wrapping around me like a dare. Cry, and you let them win. I didn't. I refused. Somewhere behind me, the party resumed. The music crept back in slowly, like nothing had happened. Vera would be laughing by now, spinning a version of events that made me sound unstable, maybe drunk. I'd seen her do it before, control the story, and you control the damage. It wasn't the first time she'd hit me. Not physically, no. That had always been reserved for tonight, apparently, but she'd delivered blows in other ways. The time I defended Grandpa during a board meeting discussion, and she called me emotionally manipulative. The Christmas I dared to ask why he was never included in the family newsletter. The subtle, gleaming ways she made me feel disposable. I thought of the guest near the restroom earlier. The man who'd mistook me for staff, who'd looked right past my face and seen utility, not identity. I wondered what he thought when he saw me get slapped. Maybe he assumed I deserved it. Maybe he still didn't know who I was. Near the edge of the party, voices carried. "Why would they treat the old man like that?" a woman said, barely above a whisper. "It's embarrassing," came a reply. "He should have stayed home." And then Vera again, clear as a bell. "To be fair," she murmured to Gideon, "he is a charity case. We've carried him long enough." My chest tightened. Charity case. That was the second time I'd heard it this week. And now I understood. It wasn't a slip. It was the script. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the photo Grandpa had slipped into my hand. I hadn't had a chance to really look at it yet. It was black and white, creased and slightly faded. Harlan stood in uniform, military, but not the standard kind. He was younger, maybe early 30s, wearing a heavy coat, gloves, and a cap with an insignia I didn't recognize. Behind him, a rusted sign read, "Moscow, 1982, File 14B. On the back, in his steady, looping cursive, "Not all wars make headlines." I stared at that line for a long time, reading it again and again until the words started to blur. I knew Harlan had served, but details were always fuzzy. No medals, no framed discharge papers, no dinner stories like other veterans I knew. If you asked, he'd smile and say, "Some things aren't mine to tell." At the time, I thought he was just being modest. Now I wasn't so sure. I pulled out my phone and typed his full name into the search bar. Nothing. Not a LinkedIn profile, not a veteran's record, not even a local obituary, just blank pages, dead ends. It was like someone had hit delete decades ago and done a good job of it. I leaned back, staring up at the stars peeking through the tree canopy. Harlan Werner, the man sitting beside the rental toilets in a suit that no longer fit, might have lived a life that made everyone else at this party look like children playing dress-up. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Joel. "You okay?" I didn't answer. Sometime later, after the staff began clearing plates and laughter rose in cycles behind me, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. He sat beside me without a word. The scent of his aftershave, a woodsy, peppered blend, immediately grounded me. "You asked the right question," Grandpa said finally. I turned to him, voice steady. "Which one?" He tilted his head toward the party. "Why am I over here? Why am I being hidden?" I waited. "Now," he said softly, "you need to ask the right people." I frowned. He gestured subtly toward the far end of the estate, just past the parked cars. Two men stood in the shadows, suits too crisp for wedding guests. One of them wore a badge on his belt, small, dark, barely visible. Not police, not local, federal, and just like that, the night shifted again. I didn't speak to anyone on the ride home. Not the driver, not the woman who shared the elevator with me up to the third floor. I just held my keys in one hand and the photo in the other, the edges soft from years tucked away. My apartment greeted me with silence. A pile of unopened mail rested on the console table by the door, and the faint smell of lavender still lingered from a diffuser I hadn't refilled in weeks. I dropped my bag, walked straight to the kitchen, and put the kettle on. Boiling water always helped me think. It didn't solve anything, but it made the noise inside me pause just enough to feel human. As I sat at the counter, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, I played the slap over in my mind. The way her voice didn't waver, the complete absence of hesitation. She knew she was going to hit me the moment I opened my mouth. It wasn't shock, it was policy. The photo lay beside me. Moscow, 1982. Not all wars make headlines. I read the note again, this time aloud. The words left a taste in my mouth, metallic, unfinished. I stood, moved to the hallway closet, and pulled down an old storage bin marked college. Beneath lecture notes, birthday cards, and a broken Polaroid camera, I found what I was looking for. A brown leather journal I hadn't opened in years. It used to be Grandpa's. He gave it to me when I was 15, told me to keep track of the quiet things. Inside, wedged between pages filled with my teenage handwriting and long-forgotten song lyrics, was an envelope. Unsealed. No postmark. Just my name. My breath caught. I remembered the day. Grandpa had handed this letter to Vera in our living room. I'd asked what it was, and she said, "Just a birthday card, nothing important." I believed her. She slipped it into a drawer, and I never saw it again. Until now. With careful fingers, I unfolded it. "Arden, if you're reading this, they didn't let me tell you in person, but I've always known you were the only one watching, the only one who remembered who I used to be before the meetings and the branding and the silence. What's coming may seem like chaos, but it's not. It's the cost of a long debt unpaid. They'll pretend it's about you. It never was. You were just too close to the truth. Look for Marchand. He'll know what to do." I sat back, blinking against the rising heat behind my eyes. The letter wasn't long, but it said more than anyone else in my family had said to me in the last 5 years. Marchand. I didn't know the name, but it felt heavy, deliberate. My phone buzzed. I ignored it. I opened my laptop and logged into the family's event portal, the one Vera had insisted we all use to celebrate digitally. I scrolled through the gallery from the rehearsal dinner, then the slideshow. Dozens of photos. Childhood shots, beach vacations, formal holidays, even candid business wins. But not one of Harlan, not one. Not at Christmas in '98, where I sat on his lap in front of the fireplace. Not at my high school graduation, where he clapped louder than anyone. Not even the family reunion he organized at the lake house. He had been there. I had the originals. I opened my own folder of prints, scanned in over the years. There he was, in every one they'd deleted. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was digital surgery. They didn't just exclude him. They erased him. And if they could do it to him, what was stopping them from doing it to me? A pit opened in my stomach, the kind you only get when a hunch becomes a fact. I typed Marchand into Google. A few entries came up. Nothing with photos, mentions in hearings from the '80s, defense contracting, a vague affiliation with a case involving sealed files and ethical violations, but nothing concrete. No one like that should be this invisible. I closed the laptop, stood, and walked to the bookshelf in my hallway. A dusty family photo from 1998 stared back at me. Everyone smiled too wide. I had always thought the books in the background were just props. But one spine caught my eye. I squinted. File 14B, Eastern Echoes. I lifted the frame, held it closer to the hallway lamp. There, clear as day, stamped across the binder's edge in red block letters, internal document, not for civilian distribution. I didn't remember anyone ever mentioning that file. I didn't remember it sitting in our house at all. But now I couldn't unsee it. And suddenly, I wasn't just looking for answers about Grandpa. I was looking at my family like I'd never seen them before. I showed up early the next morning under the thin excuse of helping with setup. The sky was still pale, and the air was heavy with the scent of turned soil and cut lemons, signs of another curated event underway. Someone had arranged tea lights along the path already, even though they wouldn't be lit for hours. That was the Dillinger way: control the atmosphere, control the narrative. Inside the estate, everything was just a little too still. People greeted me, but with the kind of over-courteous politeness that comes from fear or instruction. Even the servers made less eye contact than they had the night before. I could feel it all tightening around me like a poorly tailored dress, meant to impress but never meant to fit. I told one of the planners I'd left a scarf in the main house. She waved me through with a clipboard smile. As I walked through the kitchen to cut through to the back hallway, I caught movement near the service exit. Everett, my father, stood beside a trash bin, hands careful as he tucked something into the black plastic bag. I might have kept walking. I might have let it go, but something in his posture made me stop. He looked up and froze when he saw me. "What was that?" I asked. He hesitated, then straightened. "Nothing important, just some clutter." I walked over, ignoring the tightening in my chest. Reaching into the bag, I pulled out a wooden frame. Inside was the only photo I had from my high school graduation, where Grandpa had come. Harlan wore a suit and tie. I was smiling in a way I hadn't since. "You threw this out?" I asked, not raising my voice. Everett didn't blink. "It doesn't reflect the brand." I laughed. A single disbelieving sound. "What brand is that? Fraud?" He didn't answer, just turned back toward the hallway and walked away like I was an afterthought. Like that photo and what it meant belonged to another life they'd already rewritten. I didn't cry. I took the frame with me, wiped the smudge from the glass with my sleeve, and headed for the wine cellar. It was where the family kept all the legacy assets, old contracts, antique labels, even the signed bottle from the vineyard's first harvest. Harlan's signature was on that bottle, or at least it used to be. The keypad to the cellar beeped red when I entered the code. I tried again, locked. I walked to the side hallway and found Vera near the catering checklists. "Did someone change the code to the cellar?" I asked. She didn't look up. "It's just old junk down there. We had it sealed for renovation." "Who approved that?" She met my eyes then. "You don't have access to that anymore, Arden." I stood still, arms crossed. "Why now?" I asked. "It's not relevant anymore," she said coolly. "Time to let the past stay where it belongs." I nearly said something, nearly let everything fly, but stopped myself. Instead, I thought of something Harlan once said years ago when I'd been helping him catalog old vineyard receipts on his porch. Always back up the truth, he'd told me, flipping through water-warped pages, especially if your name isn't on the deed. Later that afternoon, I cornered Gideon by the loading dock. He was reviewing flower deliveries, playing the part of responsible groom with manufactured ease. "You're not just ignoring him," I said quietly. "You're participating in a rewrite." He looked at me like I was being dramatic. "Arden, it's not that deep." "It's exactly that deep," I snapped. "You've watched Mom strip him from every record, every toast, every photo, and you've said nothing. I'm not the one making those decisions." "No," I said, voice low. "But you are the one letting them stand." He didn't reply. I shook my head. Silence is how legacies get hijacked. That night, I sat on the floor of my room at the estate, laptop in front of me. I wasn't ready to sleep, not yet. My email inbox had 3 unread messages. One was from a name I didn't recognize, Dr. Leonard Halverson. He said he used to treat Harlan. The email was short. "Ms. Shaver, I thought you should know back in 2007, your grandfather was sedated for a minor procedure. While recovering, 2 individuals, your mother and a man I believe was her brother, presented papers transferring power of attorney. He wasn't in a condition to sign anything, but he did. I was advised not to speak of it. I'm speaking now." I sat still, heart racing. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't type anything. Later, I pulled up an old home video stored on the family cloud server. It was from that same year, labeled Harvest Toast 2007. The footage showed everyone gathered in the dining room. Harlan stood in the background, quieter than usual. Vera made a speech about fresh starts and honoring new traditions. In one frame, as the camera panned briefly past her, I caught it. She was holding a clipboard. I zoomed in, paused, adjusted contrast. Tucked beneath her hand was a manila folder. The tab was visible. It read HV, POA Doc, 2007. She wasn't protecting Grandpa. She was erasing him. And now, I had proof. I woke up with no alarm, no intention of waiting for the estate to start moving. The air was cold in that high desert way, crisp, dry, just shy of cruel. It felt clean. I sat at the edge of the guest bed and opened my laptop, the soft blue light breaking across my face. No more pacing, no more wondering what was real and what was just convenient forgetting. I started drafting a timeline. When Harlan gave the check for the down payment, when Vera started freezing him out of company events, when the cellar door was suddenly locked. I cross-checked it with emails I'd archived but never deleted. Every wedding invite that excluded him, every family post that left him out. The pattern wasn't just a story, it was data, and I was done being polite about it. I pulled up a video file from 15 years ago, the company's first vineyard celebration. Vera had given a long, dazzling speech about visionaries, about people who believed early, but nowhere in that 10-minute monologue did she mention Harlan, not once. That wouldn't have seemed odd except for one thing. I found the original lease paperwork, tucked inside an old Dropbox folder labeled Old Docs, Do Not Delete. And there, in black and white, was my grandfather's name. Signature line 2, Harlan Werner, silent equity partner. He wasn't just a sentimental figure. He was the money, the risk, the reason it had ever started. I printed the page and slipped it into a manila folder, next to a photograph of Harlan in front of the first barrel labeled Batch 001. I remembered him letting me sign it with a Sharpie when I was 11. I wrote a backwards E in my name, and he laughed like it was perfect. "Just because your name's not on the banner," I muttered to myself, "doesn't mean you weren't holding it up." The door creaked open around mid-morning. I was in the kitchen, boiling water again, my new ritual. Vera entered without knocking, already moving like the space belonged to her. "We need to talk about the menu," she said without looking at me. I didn't flinch. I placed the folder on the counter between us. "What's this?" "Proof," I said evenly, "of who built this." She flipped through it, paused at the lease, the photograph, the check stub copy, then closed the folder. "He gave what he gave," she said, placing the folder down. That doesn't mean he deserves the spotlight. You didn't just hide him, I said. You built your image on his erasure. There it was, a crack in her composure. Not wide, but visible. She tilted her chin. People remember what you tell them to remember. I smiled, but there was nothing kind in it. Not if I start telling a better story. That afternoon, while I was moving through the garden path behind the house, I heard Gideon's voice carry through the open kitchen window. I don't care about history, he was saying on the phone. People come because of the brand. Dad built the brand, not Grandpa. He's just the ghost. The tone made my stomach turn. So confident, so dismissive. I raised my phone and hit record. Later, I played the audio back. His voice, his timing, the careless arrogance. They didn't just want Harlan forgotten. They wanted him erased, and me along with him. I checked my email as I was saving the audio file. That's when I saw it. An email forwarded to me by mistake, likely from a distracted assistant. The subject line, Family Rebranding, Remove Legacy Associations. My chest tightened as I opened it. There it was in plain language, a directive from Vera to the PR team. Bullet points, clean and emotionless. Ensure Arden's shaver is not quoted or visible in upcoming press kits. Minimize references to Harlan Werner in all brand messaging. Redirect narrative to current leadership. Focus on Gideon and Vera. It wasn't just an omission, it was a campaign. I stood there, one hand on the edge of the counter, letting the heat rise slowly. Not like rage, but like resolve. If they were going to erase us both, they should have made damn sure I didn't know how to fight back. By dawn, I had stopped feeling surprised. That was its own kind of grief, I suppose, when the cut stopped stinging because you'd bled too long. I didn't need any more confirmation. They weren't just trying to leave Grandpa behind, they were methodically removing every trace he'd ever existed. I avoided the main house for most of the morning, stayed on the fringe, through the garden paths, past the old olive grove, circling like a scout instead of a guest. I knew the estate too well to get lost, and by now I also knew how they operated. I didn't need open confrontation. I needed proof. When I was 15, Grandpa handed me a key attached to a small brass compass. For emergencies, he'd whispered, like it was a spy movie. Back then, I thought he was being sentimental. Now, I wondered if he'd been planning this all along. I waited until Vera left for a site meeting, then walked the gravel stretch behind the guest house to Harlan's old storage unit. It was tucked behind a shed, half covered in ivy. The lock gave easily to the key. Inside, it smelled like dust and old pine. A metal file box sat in the far corner, with a label so faded I had to hold it under the light. It read, Echo Briefing, Declassified, 2009. I carried it to the center table, unlatched it, and slowly opened the lid. Inside were folders, some stamped redacted, others missing pages entirely. I saw typed memos, mission briefings, and photos. One in particular made my breath catch. Grandpa, decades younger, in uniform, shaking hands with a senator who had died mysteriously in the 90s. Beneath that photo was a manila envelope labeled Marchand Inquiry, Ethics Redacted. This wasn't retirement. This was exile, with terms and silence required. Near the bottom of the box, wrapped in plastic, was a formal letter from the U.S. Congress. It was dated 1987, a commendation for Harlan Werner, acknowledging classified contributions to national security, accompanied by an offer of public honor. But the response was attached. Grandpa had declined. I respectfully decline public recognition, he had written. My silence is service. Let it stand. I sat back, the letter trembling in my hand. It wasn't just that they'd ignored him. He had allowed it, to protect them, to keep them safe. And they repaid him by throwing him behind a fan next to the catering tents. That night, during the welcome dinner, Vera stood in front of the guests again, blazer crisp, wine glass in hand. We're here because of those who paved the way, she said, eyes skimming across the crowd. We honor every person who made this dream possible. I stood. Funny, I said, loud enough to cut through the music, how the ones who did the paving never get to walk the carpet. Murmurs swept the patio like wind through wheat. Vera froze. Everett rose quietly and touched my elbow. Not here, he muttered. I turned slightly. Why not? Isn't this where we rewrite things now? In public, where the real truth feels inconvenient? He didn't reply. I'm not trying to embarrass anyone, I said, scanning the faces, but maybe it's time someone else gets to speak. Later that evening, I retreated to the old garage-turned-storage room and dug through a battered drawer near the back. I'd seen a box there before, years ago. One of Grandpa's old camcorders. It still worked. Barely. I found a tape labeled Spring 2002 and popped it into the side player. Grainy footage flickered to life. There he was, Harlan, sitting at the kitchen table across from Vera. He slid a check across the table. She hesitated, then took it, eyes wide. I'll never forget this, she said on the recording. I swear. That was the same year she told everyone he refused to help when the vineyard nearly folded. She lied. And she caught herself on tape doing it. My hands curled into fists. I placed the tape back in its case and moved back to the file box. Beneath the last packet of declassified notes, a small red folder waited, stenciled across the front in bold letters, File 14B. No summary, no contents list, just my name, handwritten in faded ink. Arden Shaver. I slid it into my bag without opening it. If Grandpa trusted me with File 14B, then what was in there could change everything. And I wasn't the only one who wanted it. The brunch looked like a magazine spread. Every napkin folded like a swan, every table labeled with names that shimmered under the morning sun. I stayed in the back, close enough to hear, but not close enough to be pulled into conversation. My name wasn't on any of the cards, and no one offered me a mimosa. I watched Vera float through the crowd like she was born for it, kissing cheeks, tossing compliments, bending every sentence into a networking opportunity. Gideon stood beside her, polished and rehearsed. Their faces told a story that didn't need me. They call it family, I whispered to myself. What they mean is brand alignment. I slipped around the back of the tent, toward the library window I knew Gideon always kept open when pacing during phone calls. Sure enough, his voice echoed through the pain, just loud enough to catch. I don't care who built it, he said. People show up for the Dillinger name, not the ghost behind it. My breath hitched. I waited, still as stone. He didn't have the vision. That was all Mom and Dad. Grandpa's just a footnote. Arden? She's clinging to a man no one remembers. I stepped into view. Phone held up. He froze. You're on speaker, I said, and I hit record 30 seconds ago. He opened his mouth, closed it, then scowled. That's low, Arden. I shrugged. Not as low as rewriting someone out of their own legacy. Later, in my room, I uploaded the file to a secure drive, named it Gideon unedited.mp3. Then I created a folder labeled Werner Preservation and started uploading everything. Emails, scanned contracts, video stills. I timestamped them, cross-referenced them, tagged names. It wasn't just for me anymore. I wasn't keeping secrets. I was documenting a war. Grandpa once told me, they can bury a man, but not a paper trail. He'd been right about more than I'd ever understood. That afternoon, a forwarded email appeared in my inbox. No context, no subject line. Just a long thread between Vera and the PR team. The first thing I saw was my own name, crossed out. Ensure Arden Shaver is not quoted or visible in any press materials. Crop her from the family archive. Do not include mention of Harlan Werner in historical copy. Reframe brand narrative to focus on current leadership. It wasn't a request. It was protocol. They hadn't just sidelined me. They'd launched a silent campaign. I sent the thread to myself, then to Claire, a journalist friend from my college years who now worked at a mid-size investigative outlet. No comment, just the message. Keep it off the record. For now. I stared at the screen for a while before closing the laptop. At dinner, I dressed in black, not out of mourning, but strategy. It stood out in a sea of beige and pastels. I didn't wait to be handed a mic. I simply stood up, tapped my glass, and let the silence roll in. I'd like to make a toast, I said. People turned, uncertain. To those who paved paths they were never allowed to walk. to the ones erased from their own stories. You know who you are. Gideon dropped his fork. Vera's smile didn't break, but her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. Harlan looked up from his plate, met my gaze, and gave the smallest nod I'd ever seen carry so much weight. No one clapped. No one had to. After the meal, I slipped outside into the cool air, tension still humming in my shoulders. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the gravel path to the guest parking lot. That's when I saw him. A man in a gray suit stood leaning against the hood of my car, like he'd been waiting for me all evening. He was older, clean-cut, with a posture that suggested he never really left the military. "Miss Shaver?" he said as I approached. I didn't answer, just stood still. He reached into his coat and handed me an envelope. No seal, no return address. One word left his mouth before he turned and disappeared into a waiting black sedan. Marchand? If Marchand was real, then so were all the things they tried to hide, and someone else wanted them unburied too. I opened the envelope in my room with the same quiet reverence most people reserve for unsealing a will. The contents were clipped together, a small stack of printed pages with more black bars than sentences, like secrets swallowed in ink. On top, a handwritten note in slanted cursive. File 14B is more than a file. It's leverage. Use it, or they will. No signature, no need. I scanned the pages quickly, then scanned them again more slowly. Even in redacted form, the implications were clear. Dates aligned. Names I recognized from childhood. Judges, lawyers, donors. One name in particular caught my breath. The late family attorney, Hollis Breyer, listed next to Vera's, connected by a memo titled Medical Override Strategy, Werner. Page 22 stopped my hands. It outlined how, in 2007, a report was drafted declaring Harlan mentally compromised. The supporting documents were unsigned by medical professionals, but stamped as approved by Breyer. The signature line for Harlan was marked with a typed X, with no accompanying witness. They didn't wait for him to die. They made him disappear while he was still breathing. I copied everything, scanned it twice. The originals went into a fireproof case I kept beneath the floorboard of the guest bedroom closet. If they found them, it wouldn't matter. They'd already been sent to 3 different people, all with the subject line, insurance. It was late afternoon when I confronted Everett. He was in the cellar office, flipping through supplier invoices like nothing around him was on fire. I placed a rolled-up blueprint on his desk. "What's this?" he asked, not looking up. "Original co-development plan. Vineyard Land, 1997. It has Harlan's name on it." He stilled. Slowly, he opened the page. There it was, in faded ink. Harlan Werner, co-developer. "This isn't in the company archives," I said. "Know what is?" "The edited version with just yours and Vera's names." He set the blueprint down, not meeting my eyes. "She said no one would care," he said finally. "That people forget." I leaned in. "I don't. And I'm not alone." The rehearsal dinner was meant to be glossy and contained. Soft jazz played under fairy lights, and servers moved around with crab cakes and mini quiches on slate trays. I wore black again. They hated when I did that, called it morbid. During the toasts, I stood without being asked. "I know I'm not on the program," I said into the mic, "but I've got something worth toasting." Vera's face paled. Gideon blinked, already calculating how to stop me. "You built a legacy on silence," I said. "But the silence is done." I tapped my phone. Behind me, the projector lit up. First slide, Harlan shaking hands with a senator. Second, the original deed to the vineyard. Third, the memo from 2007 with Breyer's name and the typed X on Harlan's line. Whispers erupted. A guest near the back began recording. One of the cousins slipped out the side door, and then came the final slide. Vera's college scholarship certificate. The name of the fund, Cold War Veteran Family Educational Grant, sourced through a now-defunct account tied to a covert Veterans Assistance Program, one Harlan had helped establish. "You didn't just erase the man who gave you everything," I said, voice steady. "You used his sacrifice to build your resume, then buried him so no one would ask questions." Vera stood there, lips parted but silent. For once, she had no script. The room held its breath. Then, from the far end of the table, came the sound of a glass being set down. Harlan stood slowly. No one had heard him speak in years, not like this. He didn't raise his voice. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said, his voice gravelly but clear. But then again, they didn't ask. And just like that, the man they tried to erase took back the room with nothing but his voice. Harlan didn't rush to the mic. He didn't clear his throat to demand attention. He simply stood. And the room, hundreds of bodies dressed in coordinated shades of wine and pearl, fell silent. "I wasn't invited to speak," he began. His voice wasn't loud, but it reached every corner of that polished reception hall. Which tells me everything. No one moved, no one breathed. Even the servers froze. "I watched my name disappear one line at a time," he continued. "From documents I once signed, from pictures I once stood in, from stories I once lived." He glanced toward Vera, who sat with her hands folded too tightly in her lap. "Some people like to call it progress," he said, "but I call it what it is, convenient forgetting." A sharp inhale somewhere behind me, a sniffle. One of my younger cousins wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. "I didn't come here to ruin anything," Harlan said, quieter now. "But you can't build something worth keeping by erasing the people who gave you the ground it stands on." When he stepped back, he didn't look proud. He looked finished, and that somehow hit harder. I stepped forward, cueing the projector. A grainy video began playing above the string quartet, who had now completely stopped pretending to tune. The footage was from 2002. Harlan sitting at our kitchen table, sliding a check across to Vera. Her expression was all gratitude. "I'll never forget this," she said on camera, but she had, publicly, loudly. For years she'd told everyone he never helped, that he'd turned his back when we were desperate. Gasps followed, quiet murmurs. I didn't look at her. I looked at the guests, the investors, the people who'd shaken Harlan's hand years ago and then conveniently lost his number. A voice broke the hush. "You told us he didn't want to be involved," Vera's sister said, rising from her chair. Another voice chimed in, an older man I barely recognized. "I always felt something was off. None of this ever added up." Gideon stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "This is garbage," he snapped, eyes wild. "You don't get to hijack my wedding with this." "You hijacked it when you built it on someone else's silence," I said, steady. "Sit down." He didn't. He stormed out. The door slammed hard enough to make the candles flicker. Everett didn't follow. He didn't speak. He stared at the floor like it owed him an answer. I pulled out one last roll of paper. Blueprints, original designs for the estate. Everyone leaned in as I unfurled them across the table and placed a second copy beside them, the edited version. "Harlan Werner, co-developer," I said, pointing to the signature line. This was what it looked like before someone decided Legacy needed a different logo. The guests stared, stunned. "It's not about who signs the front of the check," I added. "It's about who built the foundation." A young woman, an assistant from the PR team maybe, pulled out her phone and began recording. She didn't even try to hide it. A few others followed suit. The next morning, a message pinged my inbox from localherald@press.net. Subject: Tip follow-up. "Do you want to go on record? Happy to keep your name anonymous until you're ready." I didn't reply right away. I had other messages to read first, texts from cousins I hadn't heard from in months. Half of them said thank you. The other half called me crazy. The family group chat was in flames, screenshots being dropped, people choosing sides. I didn't say a word in it, not one. Instead, I filed a legal petition, misrepresentation of familial contribution, suppression of financial documents, elder abuse by fraud of power of attorney. The paperwork was clean, quiet, and bulletproof. That evening, my phone buzzed again. "Hi, this is Janice from Everglow Weddings. Just letting you know, the bride's parents have pulled out of the event. No explanation given." She paused, then added, "Also, there's someone here asking for you." Said his name's Ansel Marchand. They thought the room was the end, but Marchand wasn't done, and neither was I. The cafe Marchand chose was nondescript, Tucked between an old tailor shop and a dry cleaner no one used anymore, the place smelled like scorched espresso and lemon oil. He was already there when I arrived, back straight, coat still buttoned, eyes scanning like he hadn't quite shaken the habit. "You're punctual," he said, sliding a cup toward me. "Black coffee, no cream." "You're real," I answered. He gave the smallest nod. "More than most people want to admit." We talked without names for 15 minutes. When we finally breached Harlan's, his entire body shifted, more reverence than regret. I was his handler, Phantom Echo. He was our insurance policy when everything else broke down. And when he left? They turned him into a liability, stripped the pension, buried the paperwork. He was too good to break protocol, and they banked on that. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small manila folder. "Keep this quiet," he said. But don't keep it hidden." Inside was a single printed page, confirmation of Harlan's clearance level, and the original pension agreement that had been revoked after an internal hearing never logged publicly. I walked out of that cafe and into the courthouse 3 blocks over. By lunch, I had filed 2 petitions, one to the Department of Veteran Affairs, one to the county courthouse. Power of attorney fraud, intentional suppression of legal status, elder abuse by financial coercion. I didn't post it. I didn't leak it. I let the paperwork speak louder than press conferences. Within 48 hours, local blogs caught wind of it. "The Hidden Patriot Case," one headline read. Another, "Who silences the soldiers who serve in silence?" My inbox flooded with messages. One from a widow in Iowa read, "We watched my husband's record vanish after a black ops deployment. No medal, no flag, just hush money. Thank you for not shutting up." Even the shareholders couldn't ignore it. They called an emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited, but I was CC'd on the recap email by someone whose last name I recognized, one of the cousins who'd walked out of the dinner speech early, holding her baby like a shield. Then, Marchand reached out again. He sent me a scanned form from 1994. It was a scholarship award. Recipient, Vera Dillinger. Program, Cold War Dependent Fund. Anonymous sponsor. He added a single note. He didn't want her to know it came from him. Said that would be its own kind of freedom. I forwarded it to my lawyer. Then I printed it, signed my name at the bottom, and slid it into the envelope with my legal filings. Later that night, Vera posted a public statement. Classic denial. These rumors are being spread by someone emotionally unstable. No part of my career was built on anyone else's sacrifice. I replied with one line. Here's the scholarship form. You're welcome. Gideon deleted all his social media within 2 hours. Everett, ever the ghost, sent me an email with no subject line. It said only 2 words. I knew. I didn't reply. Instead, I returned to the fireproof box and opened the final seal on file 14B. Inside was a list. No preamble, just a string of names. Dozens. Men and women, most marked with a small black X next to their entries. Cross-referencing them confirmed my worst suspicion. They were dead. Some by suicide. Some in quiet car crashes. Some vanished entirely. At the very bottom of the page was one last name. Mine. And below it, a handwritten note in a script I now recognized as Marchand's. If you speak next, you won't just break the family. You'll break the system. I stared at that sentence for a long time. But I wasn't trying to break anything. I was trying to heal what they buried. Even if it meant burning everything else down, the silence inside the estate wasn't like before. It didn't hum with judgment or tension. It just existed. The kind of quiet that settled in once the performance ended and the audience left. Half-drunk champagne flutes still clung to linen-draped tables. The floral arch remained, but its roses had wilted slightly overnight, drooping like they'd finally been allowed to rest. I walked the main hallway alone. Every door cracked open, every corridor still scented faintly of perfume, stress, and too many lies in the same room. The weight that had pressed on my chest for weeks was gone. But so, too, was the noise, the buzzing pressure of pretending. It's amazing how peaceful it gets when the performative love clears out. I turned toward the back patio and made my way across the lawn. The folding chair was still there. The same one they'd placed near the catering tent, beside the industrial fan and the garbage cans, where they'd thought Harlan would quietly fade into the corner of their celebration. I picked up a clean linen napkin from a serving tray someone had forgotten. I folded it once, twice, and placed it gently across the seat of the chair. "You won't be forgotten again," I said out loud. My voice didn't shake. It didn't even rise. It just landed and stayed. It wasn't a chair anymore. It was a monument to resistance, to truth, to someone they never deserved. Back inside, the estate felt colder. Vera hadn't reached out since the blow-up. Gideon hadn't so much as texted, and I didn't miss either of them. Later that afternoon, an email arrived from Everett. Subject: None Arden. I stayed quiet because I thought it was protecting all of us. I told myself I was avoiding escalation, but I see now. That's not strength. That's fear. Do what you must. I didn't reply. I printed the message and filed it in the same folder that held the photo from my graduation, the wine deed, and my grandfather's signed check. It was early evening when I pulled out the old book labeled Noise Reduction. I'd found it in a bin of Harlan's, half filled with electronics and wires. Tucked inside, wrapped in a paper napkin, was a flash drive. I plugged it in. There he was, sitting in his den. The lighting dim, his face older, wearier, but still him. "If you're watching this," he said, "then you've found what they didn't want you to find." He took a breath. I knew they would try to erase me. I just didn't expect they'd be so thorough or so efficient. He chuckled once, softly. "They can write you out of the will. They can edit you out of pictures, but they can't delete your soul from the truth. That stays, even if only one person remembers it." He paused, then looked into the camera like he was looking directly at me. "Thank you for being that one person, Arden. It was the only time I cried that day." Later, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad and a glass of water. I started drafting the bylaws for the nonprofit I'd been mulling over for weeks. "Silent lines," I wrote at the top. "A foundation to archive names like Harlan's, people who gave everything and got silence in return." I didn't want to erase the pain. I just wanted to give it space to be remembered. Just before midnight, as I was sealing an envelope to submit the 501c3 paperwork, there was a knock at the door. I froze, not from fear, from a strange sense of completion. When I opened it, a man in uniform stood in the hallway, hat in hand. "Miss Shaver?" he asked. I nodded. "There's been a request to declassify part of File 14B from Langley." Maybe the truth hadn't just survived. It had been waiting for someone stubborn enough to open the door. He wasn't in uniform this time, but I knew exactly who he was. Same posture, same silence. The man from Langley didn't knock twice, just waited, patient, outside my door. "Miss Shaver," he said, offering a thick envelope. "File 14B has been partially cleared for civilian custodianship. You're named as the sole narrative executor." His words landed with more weight than I expected. "There's also a signed affidavit confirming Mr. Werner's covert service. It's official now." I nodded slowly, taking the envelope. He didn't linger. When the door clicked shut behind him, I sat on the edge of the couch and opened the packet with hands that somehow stayed steady. Inside was confirmation of everything: his history, his clearance, the programs he'd operated under. At the very end, a clause I hadn't seen before. If his service was ever proven and publicly denied, full custodial rights to the family's brand, including trademarks, historical narrative, and philanthropic branches, would revert to the trust he'd quietly placed under my name 10 years prior. I blinked, reading it again. Then again. I called the lawyer listed in the footer. It was early, but he picked up. "Yes," he confirmed, his voice calm and practiced. "Miss Shaver, you now hold controlling interest in all legacy-related assets of the Dillinger brand. Not because I fought for it, because he gave it to me long before I ever thought to ask." That afternoon, I called for a private sit-down. No press, no lawyers, just family, if that word still meant anything. Vera sat across from me, jaw clenched. Everett stood by the window, hands behind his back. Gideon arrived last, sunglasses still on indoors. I slid the documents across the table, copies of the signed affidavits, the legacy clause, and the video confession. "You built a brand on a lie," I said. "I'm reclaiming it with truth." No drama, no raised voices. Vera stood slowly, gathered her bag, and walked out without saying a word. Everett stayed, but he said nothing. Gideon sank into a chair, eyes glassy, and muttered, "What happens now?" "You figure out who you are without the illusion," I replied, "and maybe stop cashing checks that were written by a man you tried to erase." The following week, I released a short documentary titled The Silent Line. It was 27 minutes long, featuring the home videos, Harlan's confession, scanned documents, timelines, and the list of names I'd found in File 14B. Not just Harlan's, others, all vanished in the shuffle of national pride and political strategy. It trended within hours. Veteran groups shared it, small-town newspapers picked it up, then larger outlets. Eventually, the Department of Defense issued a statement acknowledging historical oversights in recognition. And then came the final twist. An official notice from the CIA, Harlan Werner, posthumously recognized for classified operations, his pension, retroactively granted. Per his signed instruction, it was transferred in full to the Silent Line Foundation. At the dedication ceremony, I stood beside a simple bronze plaque engraved with his name. I didn't wear black. "He wasn't forgotten," I said to the small crowd gathered. "He was waiting for someone loud enough to carry the silence." There were tears, and not just mine. I went home that evening with wind in my hair and dust on my heels. The estate was empty now, abandoned by those who had shaped it with revision, and reclaimed by the one person who wouldn't let them write over history again. I walked to the chair under the olive tree, the one where they first placed him to hide him in plain sight. I set down File 14B, sealed again, and rested it on the cushion. "This was never yours to bury," I whispered. Then I turned, slow but sure, and walked back across the lawn, the gravel crunching beneath each step like punctuation. Legacy isn't what we leave. It's what we rescue when others try to steal it, because somewhere there's another forgotten file, and I'm not done opening them.